Good morning everyone, and welcome to a very strange Sunday in Sheffield. A Sunday like I think almost nobody living has ever seen before in week 6 of our national lockdown. And I thought this might be a nice time to show you around this garden, which would normally be opening around this time of year and again in June and July, and indeed this year's open days were all scheduled for June and July for the National Gardens scheme, but obviously aren't going to happen. So I'm Dave, and the house I live in is now 92 years old, and before this house was built this was farmland. My grandparents were the first owners of this house, and in 1928 they started to lay out this garden, which until then had been cow pasture, and indeed in those days there were still cows in the field over the fence at the bottom of the garden, where you'll see shortly. Normally on open days, if I do a guided tour for people, I start at the very front of the house, in the street, and talk about how grandfather first created one long continuous border, which went from the front wall right to the back fence, uninterrupted past the house. But for this video I'm going to focus on the back garden only, although I may add a short silent clip of the flowers in the front garden at the end. So let's see the garden rather than me, and what you can see behind me is a reflection of the garden in the door to the workshop. And now here is the very uninspiring view straight down the garden path, but let's take a closer look at what happens in this garden. As soon as you step out of the door, you're greeted with Solomon's seal, just beginning to open its flowers, always a very elegant and graceful plant. And although it hasn't been in this exact position since 1928, when grandfather laid out the garden, they always had Solomon's seal in this garden. And a lot of things in this garden have been in their current position since 1928. One example of that is the American pillar rose, which now scrambles up this small holly tree that I'm growing at the back of the house. But originally, this particular American pillar rose grew up the side of next door's shed, and in later years a garage, both of which long since disappeared. Now it goes across the roof of my extension, where it joins the Hydrangea petularis, which as you can see is also developing flower buds, and will soon provide a beautiful fragrant cloud of creamy white flowers smothering the whole of the back of the house. The long herbaceous border was Grandad's first border, which I mentioned a moment ago, and originally it passed the house and went straight to the front garden. The border in the early days, when Mum was a child, was planted mainly with roses, phlox, peonies, delphiniums and other similar, very traditional cottage garden style flowers. There are still many peonies in this garden, and there are still quite a few phlox. Grandad moved all the roses, long before he died in 1959, into two distinct rose beds, one at the front and one at the back, and we shall see one of them shortly. This border is a few weeks away from being its best for the year. You can see at a glance that there are many things growing well, but not yet filling all the gaps, and so there are still patches of bare earth between things. However, we already have a lovely display of Dicentra Spring Gold. We've had many tulips, sadly most of them now past their best for this year, but a good few still remain, giving beautiful splashes of colour. Bluebells, some of them unintentional, are creeping in, and larger plants are beginning to flourish and develop ready for later in the year. This is Cranberry cordifolia, which will soon send up very large leaves and completely cover any bare earth in this area. Foxgloves are coming up too. At one time I used to eradicate all the foxgloves as weeds, and then I realised I'd gone too far and had none left. And they're really a very harmless plant and so easy to remove in the wrong place that there's no difficulty about letting them do their own thing. and just weeding out ones that are not wanted. And so now I'm a little less eager to remove them. We'll proceed down the garden shortly and you'll see other things in the top border. But let's turn to the other side of the path. Here there is a rockery. Grandfather was a very artistic garden creator, and his original rockery was more like that which you can see in the distance in this view, which is a very natural landscaped rockery, looking just like a natural outcrop of rocks in the Peak District. The whole of his rockery, all the way along, used to look like that, and as a child I was often told off for clambering up it and standing on the stones, and told that would loosen them, although it never did because they were so well laid. Unfortunately, when I had the workshop built in the late 1990s, much of the building rubble was piled up against the rockery and on the lawn, and the result was that after months of work, when I cleared the rubble and soil away, the weeds in the rockery had taken hold so well, being the only things that survived, having building rubble on top of them, that I had to almost rebuild the rockery to get the twitch and other tenacious weeds out. And that's why it's now no longer quite so natural looking, because sadly I lack the artistic skills that Grandfather used to have. As we approach the end of the rockery, we can see the remaining flowers of Leucodium, the summer snowflake, which were all remaining beautifully erect until only a few days ago when we had strong wind, and despite the arrangement of small canes and pea sticks which I've fastened around them, they've now sadly begun to splay apart and look less tidy. They still bear their beautiful flowers for several weeks yet. They're one of the most long-lasting flowers in the garden. Roses were a particular favourite of my grandparents, and they remain a favourite of mine. And one of the oldest and now weakest is a Dorothy Perkins Rambler. As you can see, there is lush new growth. And shortly that stem will reach the rustic pergola, over which we have other roses still scrambling, many of them very vigorously, and completely covering the top with flowers in the summer when all the shoots have blossom on them. At the other side of the entrance to the pergola, we've retained very traditional planting with tulips, sadly now just past their best for this year, further roses, and plants such as the Allium bulgaricum, now renamed and reclassified. In other words, the Fairies' Castle Allium. And as you can see, there are buds here which will soon blossom and look spectacular. We're joined by Evadne, who's come to see what's happening. Further around in this area, one of the oldest plants in the garden is this peony. I don't know the variety, but it has the most massive, bright crimson flowers. And until only a year ago, this formed a huge clump that filled the whole of this space, where Evadne is now standing. But sadly, something infected the root last year, and it turned very slimy and unpleasant. I dug out all of the slimy root and threw it away. And thankfully, some small satellite pieces of rhizome naturalised without any encouragement for me around the area and are still growing well. So hopefully this peony will live for another 90 years. I can't show the bottom border of the garden easily without showing next door's garden, which clearly is not desirable. So I'll just move to this angle so that you can hopefully see that along the bottom border we have a large number of Frensham rose bushes interspersed with other smaller roses. These also have been here since the late 1920s and continue to thrive and flourish every year. And indeed, we can see here that buds are beginning to form, and there will soon be a great profusion of beautiful crimson and pink flowers. At the back of the house, I now have a small fountain where once there was just crazy paving. This was created from a bird bath which I adapted, but the birds still use it. In fact, the birds are very keen on the running water, both to bathe in and to drink. And the fountain is surrounded by London Pride, which always smothered the crazy paving in this area and has done since before Mother can remember. We'll continue our tour now, passing further towards the top border. We'll go through the rustic pergola and up the steps, which again have been in place since 1928, haven't shifted. Here we can see other peonies. This one is a white peony. I don't know the variety, and again it's been here since the 1930s. We have the rose masquerade, which will shortly start to flower. And we have a clematis. This one is Hagley hybrid. My grandparents never grew clematis as far as I know. Mum certainly doesn't remember any ever being here. But I've always liked clematis, and it was only quite late in life that I discovered just how many different varieties there were. And so I now have a number of them around the garden in various different places. One of my favourite low growing plants is this viola, Rosscastle Black. This particular plant has been in now for nearly 10 years, even though it's only meant to be an annual. And every year the clump comes back to life after winter and has these spectacular velvety blooms. I'm always quite keen to try to grow things from seed, especially unusual things. The monkey puzzle tree was a great favourite of 1930s gardens, but there was never one in this garden. In fact, my grandparents never planted any trees in this garden at all. This monkey puzzle is now about 10 years old, and I grew it from seed. As you can see, it's growing quite healthily and very straight. It took about 7 years to reach a height of about 18 inches and begin to be visible over the top of the surrounding shrubs. But now it is almost 4 feet tall and put on at least 18 inches in the last 1 year alone. And so I think I can say that it's found its feet, and hopefully it will grow into be a very spectacular and well-placed tree. My grandparents also certainly would not have had any kind of garden ornaments, such as these statuettes. In the first place, they wouldn't have been able to afford them. In the second place, since none of them ever drove, and neither do I, they would have had great difficulty of procuring them in days when garden centres didn't exist, and deliveries would certainly have cost a large amount of money. I saw these in a garden centre in Derbyshire about 12 years ago, and they were standing next to each other in the garden centre's yard, much closer than they are now. But with my mischievous sense of humour, I thought that Pandora had the look rather of somebody who had been caught by the postman ringing the doorbell whilst in the shower, hastily grabbed a towel and come to peer out of the door and see who was calling. Even more mischievously, the person I was with at the time in the garden centre had a different explanation for the look on Pandora's face as she looked over at David. I'll leave that one to your imagination. But I decided that they would look quite nice in the garden, standing each side of what then was just a plan for having a laburnum arch. I made the tunnel up from a kit of parts and tried several times in vain to grow laburnum trees all along both sides of it, each time the slugs eating off the trees and completely removing them to ground level before they had a chance to become strong enough to survive. And so I planted wisteria instead. The wisteria still grows, but it's taken me many years to correctly work out how to prune it to promote good flowers rather than just the odd one or two. As you can see, it looks as though this year we should have quite a nice display of flowers, providing the frost doesn't return. In the meantime, laburnum seedlings which grew in the rockery and other places from seeds that had fallen from next door's tree seemed to be quite immune to slugs, despite the ones I wanted to grow being attacked regularly. And so I potted on several laburnum seedlings, and now, about 5 years on from doing that, I have 2 very healthy trees and some smaller ones in between which are now growing and starting to climb the arch. And in fact, the one at the far end has now reached the stage where this year there will be quite a nice display of beautiful golden flowers covering approximately half of the archway. This part of the garden used to be purely vegetables. As I mentioned earlier, my grandfather died in 1959 and I wasn't born until 1968, so I certainly never knew him. But until the end of the war, from the back fence of the garden, which we will reach shortly, as far back as the concrete steps underneath the rustic pergola, which we came up a moment ago and which are here, the entire garden, from the top border right down to the bottom, consisted of vegetables in neat regimented rows grown to a very high standard. Once the war ended, Grandfather, I think, grew a little tired of vegetables, because it was at that point that he planted this rose bed and moved roses out of the top border into a more formal rose bed. Therefore I always know this as the 1945 rose bed, though Grandfather certainly didn't give it any names. And the rest of this area, now lawn, borders and so on, was used for still growing some vegetables, but also chrysanthemums, dahlias, sweet peas, all for show. Grandad was a keen flower shower. After Grandfather died in 1959, my grandmother, newly widowed, faced with still having to work and many years of her working life left, and maintain the house and the garden, single-handedly built the concrete wall which now holds up this lawn terrace, and laid the lawn in order to make the garden easier to maintain on her own. We shall see the wall that she built as we come round the other side of the garden. The greenhouse, not this one but an earlier incarnation, had been built 1 year before Grandfather died. He got very little use from it, but his original stood until well into the late 1980s, and was replaced several years later, after a short period with no greenhouse, by this one, which we'll look in a moment. The cast iron street lamp, which does light up at night, came from the top of this road when the council were replacing them all with modern ones, and I was able to purchase the column and plant it into the garden. Again, Grandma and Grandad would never have had such things in their garden, but the layout of this garden hasn't altered since approximately 1960, when Grandma put this lawn down and the path at the other edge of it, as I've already mentioned. Every other aspect of the garden is as it was in the 1920s and 30s, when grandparents laid it out. We'll proceed along the top border. We can see that we have tulips still flowering, and a great many alliums will shortly start to flower as well in this area, which I have smothered with them. We also have the hazel contorta, which bears many nuts in the autumn and attracts birds, squirrels and other wildlife, birds to nest in it, squirrels to eat from it. And we also have other bird attracting plants in the garden, for example this mahonia, about to burst into berry, which will remain for many months, purple and spectacular, and the birds will then strip them later in the year. There are tiger lilies here, which were given by an in-law many years ago, which continue to bloom without any effort at all. And despite the massive slug problem, which has decimated laburnum trees more than once, as I mentioned, the hostas seem to do remarkably well, and seem to be, relatively speaking, immune to slug damage. A further peony, this one a very deep pink frilly one. Sadly, again, I don't know its name, but I know it's been here since at least 1930. When it opens, this has the most beautiful blousy flowers, very reminiscent of William Morris Arts and Crafts illustrations. And a more modern peony, I do actually know the name of this one. This one's Bowl of Beauty, which I bought quite recently, and complements the one that I've just described very well. I'm always a sucker, pardon the pun, for rescuing plants that seem to have been cast off by other people. This larch tree was being thrown out at the local nursery, having outgrown its pot long since, not been watered, left in the sun, and looking like a dead pole with little sign of life. The man couldn't quite believe that I was asking if I could have it, and allowed me to take it for £1 to represent the cost of the pot, which was a clay one. That was 2 years ago. As you can see, it's very much alive now, and I'm delighted to see the cones that come every autumn and provide a beautiful display. Even when they're dried out the following year, they're still clinging to the branches. We've now reached the end of the garden, or at least as far as we can get these days, and a little more of the history of the garden is disguised in the pond. There are now goldfish in this pond, and as you can see, a fountain which provides a pleasant sound. The pond, in fact, was a cold frame earlier in my life, and you can see the brickwork of the original cold frame. Except the cold frame wasn't the original. In actual fact, the pond represents the first building that was ever put into this garden in 1939. These are the bricks. In fact, this is the old air raid shelter, a mere 6 foot by 4 foot, and going underground by nearly 4 feet, bringing the total height to only just over 5 feet when there was a concrete slab roof across the top of it at the height of the top of this pond. This was where the family sheltered during the air raids and the Sheffield Blitz. After the war, Grandad deposited a small amount of soil and rubble in the base of the shelter, built glass covers for it, and used it as a cold frame. When I moved here, the glass covers had long since decayed and fallen apart, and so I put more soil in the bottom to bring the level up, fitted a liner, and turned it into a pond. It's still quite deep, almost 3 feet deep in fact, so nearly the depth still of the old air raid shelter. At the other side of the path, a smaller pond where the fountain doesn't run for most of the year because it's full of newts and tadpoles, is left unfiltered and grown for the benefit of wildlife. And in a short time, a week or so if the weather continues as it is now, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks if the weather turns cooler again, this pond will be surrounded by the flowers of the iris, the lilies, a great many annuals such as Aquilegia at the other side of the pond, and at this side we'll have these beautiful pink bottlebrush flowers which have naturalised and are frequently mistaken by garden visitors as docks, until they see the flowers and realise that this is not an unkempt patch of weeds, but in fact a superb patch of beautiful waterside flowers. We'll now go onto the steps that lead behind the greenhouse, and you can see up to the very end of the garden. Please excuse the water butt on the left. This is waiting until after the lockdown when someone can help me to move it, as it was here in temporary storage over winter whilst some maintenance was done near to the house where it normally stands. I'm not big on garden gnomes, but I am quite sentimental, and when my next door neighbour died, her children offered me the gnome from the garden as a remembrance of her, and I accepted willingly, as she was a very nice lady, but placed George the Bowler, as he's known, here at the end of the garden, out of the way, where he wasn't a main feature. The reason I'm letting you see this part of the garden, a little bit unkempt in some ways, is because here we have the original fence, a chain link fence. The stoops have been replaced many times now, over which you can see next door's gardens. But this is where Mum used to come and stroke the noses of the cows for the first 10 years of her life, until the fields over the back became the next road. Also here we have the graves of my 3 previous puscats, and this is an area which is left to wildlife. I do tidy up, I do remove weeds, especially things like dandelions, but the main purpose of this area, underneath a Christmas tree which was once grown from seed, used in the house, planted out 30 years ago and has now become vast, and a hawthorn tree planted by birds dropping seeds from berries they'd eaten. I have a very large bird table, and as you can see, a number of bird feeders, and you can probably hear the birds merrily and busily chirruping as they come for their breakfast. I made a point of trying to attract starlings because they'd become endangered, unlike when I was a child and they were such common birds. And now most years the starlings nest in next door's hawthorn tree, and we often have upwards of 50 starling chicks at any one time clamouring for food once they've fledged. Despite the fact that I attract all the birds, I am very thankful to say that none of the cats I've ever had, including Evadne, despite the fact she's climbing on a bird table, have ever shown much interest in trying to catch birds, although Evadne is an extremely efficient mouser and all too regularly brings me mice into the house. But thankfully she seems to understand, as did her predecessors, that I want the birds as well as I want her, and so she doesn't seem to bother them very much. Returning to the small wildlife pond, you can see from this angle how I've created the bed of iris and other flowers around the pond, which will shortly bloom. Near to the greenhouse I grow a few things in containers. I'm particularly keen on the Persicaria. This one is Persicaria Sergeant Major, which appears to be a more robust plant, as it very rarely dies back completely in the winter, whilst its partner at the other side of the door, Persicaria Batswing, always seems to die back completely and often gives me a fright by taking a very long time before there is sign of new growth in the spring. Although, as you can see, this year, as others, it has now begun to develop leaves, and although the stems haven't yet grown more than a few millimetres above soil level, you could still just see the batswing pattern on the leaves. And so here is the greenhouse, complete with Grandad's original greenhouse heater from the 1950s. At this time of year there isn't an awful lot in the greenhouse. There's a few fennel seedlings just beginning, some dianthus that are ready for pricking out, and one or two things that were overwintered. And very sadly this last winter I did lose almost all of my collection of auriculae, but thankfully I know a very good local enthusiast from whom I'm sure I'll be able to obtain more young plants and grow again. I also have some ginger taking root ready to go on the allotment. The greenhouse often becomes completely overrun in the later part of the summer by the passion flower, Passiflora incense, which fills the whole of the roof space and is absolutely dripping in flowers for a great length of time. And I'm also very pleased that this Strelitzia regina, or bird of paradise flower, which I grew from seed 12 years ago alongside the monkey puzzle, does seem to flower roughly once every other year. And if I'm lucky, this year should be a flowering year, since last year was not. The very end of the garden, at the bottom side of the slope, is where I have a compost bin, water butt, but determined to use every last inch of the space, just as Grandad used to. I've also got Weigela and Clematis and a small Photina bush, which actually has become very leggy because of the shade, but still has the beautiful characteristic leaves high up, adding a splash of colour. And the bottom border of the garden, beyond this rhododendron, is now the fruit border. My grandparents didn't grow fruit as such, other than rhubarb and gooseberries, which we'll come to in a moment, and I think they only grew those because the plants had been given to them by chapel friends when they were first married in 1927. I now have blackcurrant and redcurrant bushes, which as you can see are doing quite well. And further on in this border I have rhubarb, including the original plant from the 1920s, and I have the gooseberries, again from the 1920s. But I also have a plum tree, which we will come to shortly, And we're now standing underneath the quince. The variety is Varanga, and it has the most beautiful flowers. In a moment I'll step up onto the lawn to show you a better view of them without the sun shining at them. And it does now crop heavily, unless the flowers are caught by frost. The year before last I had 98 quince from this small tree. If you're a garden visiting enthusiast, and if you have visited the Derbyshire area or live nearby, there's a very high chance that at some point you will have visited Fanshawe Gate Hall, until 2016, when sadly both John and Cynthia died, the home of the Ramsden family since the 1950s. When John and Cynthia, extremely good friends of mine, died, their daughters offered me this 16th century stone trough with the very 20th century nymph that Cynthia had with it as a remembrance, and this now sits in my bottom border under the quince tree as a constant reminder of John and Cynthia and the huge amount of encouragement that they gave to me when I first considered opening my garden for the National Garden Scheme. Moving further along the fruit border, in actual fact some things that aren't fruit are creeping in. For example, I'm growing wild garlic here, and I hope that it will naturalise and fill up the area around these evening primrose and up to Cynthia's trough, as I think that will make quite a nice attractive display when the flowers are open and complement the quince above with the contrasting smell. I also have a rosemary plant which I allowed to get very large by mistake and am now training into a shape using an obelisk to assist. And then I have the rhubarb. 3 days ago I harvested the first crop for this year and got nearly 9 pounds of rhubarb from it in one pull, and as you can see plenty more rhubarb is forming again. Underneath the plum tree we have chives and garlic growing, and also some strawberries which are actually self-set from elsewhere in the garden. And the plum tree has had plenty of flowers this year, so I'm hopeful of actually getting a good crop of fruit. And then we have the gooseberries. These are a red dessert gooseberry and were planted in 1929 from pieces of cuttings given to Grandma and Grandad by chapel friends. And these elderly bushes covering this small stretch of border usually yield something in the order of 3 stone of fruit each year, without any real effort at all from me, beyond pulling out weeds from underneath them and giving them the occasional drink of Miracle-Gro, usually very early in the spring when the buds first start to form, and again in the autumn before the winter dormant period. On the other side of the path by the fruit border we have a very narrow floral border against the lawn which Grandma laid in the 1960s, 1960 I believe, and I mentioned earlier on that she'd done this single-handedly, and that she'd also single-handedly built the concrete wall to retain the garden. And from this angle you can see that it is quite a lengthy wall and by no means insubstantial in height, approximately 2 feet tall. No mean feat for a widowed lady, particularly at a time when this sort of thing was definitely considered to be man's work. This saxifrage, Peter Pan, makes the most beautiful carpet of crimson each year. And although the violets are, as far as I'm concerned, a weed because they're so prolific and have such huge roots, there are places such as here where I do allow them to continue to grow, at least until they've flowered, because they look so beautiful, especially contrasting with the saxifrage. And here we can see the 1945 rosebed from a different angle. Many of the roses are now very weak, but I refuse to remove them whilst ever they're growing at all and produce even one puny flower each year, because most are varieties that you can no longer get. And as you can see, I have them all labelled, having used Grandad's original pencil sketches in a notebook that was in the bookcase, to see which bush he'd planted in which position. I have replaced one or two, but many varieties, as I say, are no longer available, and so I'm determined to keep them going as long as I can, however pathetic or puny they may seem. On this side of the rustic pergola I have two abutilons. Megapotamicum is one of them, the other I do not know the name. It simply came from a garden centre labelled as abutilon. But interestingly, the one whose name I don't know has much more pointed leaves than the Megapotamicum, and the flowers which it has are much more profuse in number, but much smaller. There's also massive, ancient, climbing and rambling roses, which smother the whole of the pergola in flowers and scent in July each year. We're now returning towards the house and have come round to the bottom of the steps through the rustic pergola and back onto the lawn, and I've just spotted a dandelion, so I'm going to apologise for it because there's no point in trying to pretend it's not there. This weeping tree fountain, which is quite loud when it's running and will turn itself on at lunchtime on a timer, is the latest feature of the garden, although I have now had it more than 10 years. And it was an impulse purchase, which then required digging a hole in the lawn. It looks rather tatty at the moment because the crocuses, which looked beautiful in February and March, have finished flowering, because I can't cut down the leaves and the grass between them until they die back naturally in June. Otherwise the bulbs will weaken and I won't have flowers again next time. And so that is a short tour of the garden, which, if you wish to visit it under the National Garden Scheme, will certainly be open again as soon as we're allowed to do so. I hope you've enjoyed, and if this video is well received, I will be happy to make another one later in the year when plants and flowers are more advanced. And let's hope that whether or not we're all back at work by then, I can find another morning which is so beautifully quiet and where you're able to hear all the bird song and the fountains as I do so. Thank you for watching.